for the state. I believe the single most important recommendation to come out of the Tax Commission's report is the rainy day fund. Now, reasonable minds may disagree as to how that rainy day fund would be set up, but the general concept is that you address volatility not by reducing your revenue, but by saving in those years that you have a lot of revenue for those years that are going to be more lean. As for the BNRT, we have numerous questions and concerns about the BNRT, and the number one concern is that the BNRT has not really been tried anywhere else in this form. Yes, it's similar to a value-added tax, but the fact that only 3 other states have tried anything, 3 or 4 other states have tried anything similar here in the U.S. Causes great concern in terms of California's competitiveness with respect to administrative burden on businesses. So whereas in every other state you're piggybacking on the federal adjusted gross income for the determination of the state income tax, in this case it's reinventing the wheel when you're doing your taxes, and I think that could be very problematic for California's competitiveness. The other thing is that since we don't know how this tax is necessarily going to work, whether it's going to be successful, and we haven't had sufficient time to evaluate the Michigan example, if it's unsuccessful and we have thrown away what has been a reasonably robust revenue structure, the consequences of that fiscally could be dire. I understand that there is a phase-in, but that phase-in brings all sorts of uncertainty and unpredictability for businesses. So we have a lot of concern about that. The other issue is that I'm not at all convinced that volatility is going to completely go away under this new tax structure, and it won't completely go away under a pure rainy day fund approach. Is there a certain amount of volatility that we can live with? Probably so, particularly if we look at our entire fiscal structure. But in this, with the BNRT, shifting to a consumption tax, you're still going to see shifts when the economy slows, because people are buying fewer goods and businesses are contracting, and so all of the revenue that would be generated from purchases is going to slow as well. It might be less volatile, I really don't know, but I don't think that we can count on that necessarily. Insofar as this tax isn't based on profit but only on gross receipts, it really could be an impediment to starting a new business. It's hard enough for a new business who doesn't generate profit in the first few years to cover their rent, their employees, their equipment, all of those things that go along with running a business. Now you're going to add to that more taxation. That just might be the marginal piece that keeps folks from even trying to start a new business. And I think that would be a problem for the economy. One thing also has been said about the BNRT, that it's less regressive than the current sales tax. And I don't necessarily buy that. It may be, once again, I don't know, but here's the thing to consider, and I think Mr. Mickey touched on that, on this, and that is that with the sales tax we exempt the necessities of life. So really we tax those things that are purchased with folks' disposable income. We exempt food, we exempt health care, we exempt people's rent, we exempt their medicine, and now we're going to go to a system where we now tax all those things. And I think that that's of concern. So, and my last point is that I know that Chairman Parsky asked us all to really focus on the rate as a positive aspect of the BNRT, but we don't have a commitment to a rate. We don't know what that rate's going to be. How can we focus on a rate if we don't have a commitment to a rate? And the rate is not the only issue. It's the real life tax liability that's going to be the issue. So for those folks who in the personal income tax structure that had their rates reduced, and because the credits are taken away, their tax liability increases, that matters. That matters regardless of whether their rate is reduced. And the same thing with the business community. If you're expanding the base and you're removing deductions, there's more than just the rate that matters. I don't want to seem too negative, my goal is certainly not to instill fear or confusion. But I think that these are legitimate concerns that need to be looked at. In conclusion, I want to say that I realize our tax system isn't perfect, and certainly over the course of many, many years, this tax system has been evolving. It's not like we went from the tax structure's inception and we didn't do anything, and now all of a sudden we have a 21st century economy that we need to address. We've been slowly changing it over time, and yeah, we could take a look at our tax structure and figure out how to reduce some volatility. But I don't think that throwing the baby out with the bathwater is necessarily the right thing to do. Mr. Taylor, the legislative analyst, mentioned that he thinks that our tax structure has performed fairly well, and I think that you remarked upon that as well, Mr. Chair. We have roughly, our tax system's diversified. We have roughly 1/3 consumption, 1/3 property tax, 1/3 based on income, and it takes into account the ability to pay. And I think that that's a value that we've established as a society. We want people to not pay more than they can afford to pay. So I think that our current tax system is equitable, and over time it's grown. One estimate that we've come up with is roughly 9% per year. I don't want you to quote me on that because it's just a general estimate. But I guess what I want to leave you with, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and do no harm. You may want to tweak it. You may want to repair it a little bit, but don't throw it out. I don't think it's the right thing to do.
All right. Mr. McHaley. Okay, wait a minute.
Well, Mr.
Karnak, I believe that you will testify on enterprise zones. No.
Actually, I want you to know I'm here as the executive director of the recently formed Committee to Protect the Steelhead Restoration Tax Credit. It would be done away with, and somebody's got to speak up for them. First, I wanted to mention on behalf of the Los Angeles County Transportation Authority that we actually applaud the Commission's recommendation to retain the state portion of the sales tax on gas and diesel. That protects the public transportation account and Prop 42. And as you're probably aware, public transportation in the state over the last 3 or 4 years has seen diverted in excess of $3 billion in state assistance for local transit needs. Prop 42 funds are needed for highway improvement, transit and rail, and local streets and roads. So on behalf of MTA, I wanted to make that comment. On the broader discussion on behalf of some of the businesses that we represent, I think the fundamental concern, of course, is the BNRT. And just to touch upon a couple of things, continuing where Ms. Peelsticker ended, is the uncertainty over the rate. The Commission talks a lot about 4%. However, of course, as we know from the draft language, there isn't an actual specified percentage. There are some who believe that a rate as high as 6% would be needed to fully make up for the lost revenue on the other 3 taxes that would be reduced. Of course, if you heard the description from some of the commissioners earlier today, there might be a little bit of a misnomer here, because in fact what they indicated is if you max out at the 4%, then we won't reduce the sales tax the full amount. And what some folks have determined, particularly in the aerospace industry where we do a lot of work, assuming you eliminate the corporate tax, assuming you eliminate the state share of the sales tax on all your equipment purchases, and utilize a 4% BNRT, some have calculated a doubling of their current state tax liability under that scheme. Now, assuming that you cap the BNRT at the 4%, but actually don't fully reduce the state share of the sales tax, then clearly their state tax liability is going to more than double, because there might be 1 or 2% of the state share on the sales tax on heavy equipment purchases. And all the manufacturing type businesses, if they don't see a full reduction, then clearly they're going to pay, continue to pay a higher sales tax than all those other states that either provide a partial or full exemption from the sales tax. The modeling, this is done purely so far on a static model, as best we can ascertain. I mean, in other words, if we're collecting X amount from the state share of the sales tax and you eliminate it, I think that was determined to be $27 billion. But what is at least 4%, if not potentially higher, BNRT going to produce? And clearly, no modeling has taken that into account. All we've done is we basically said, geez, if we're collecting X amount under the sales tax and we get rid of it, then we have to make up an equivalent $27 billion for that, 10 to 12 billion on the corporate tax, eliminate that, we've got to make it up over here. But what are the cost implications on that BNRT? And if some businesses, again speaking specifically to the aerospace industry, are going to see a doubling of their state tax liability under that proposal, that's going to be detrimental clearly to their investment, job retention, job creation in the state of California. And one of the 6 charges of the Commission is to encourage economic development. And at least from that perspective, it doesn't appear to be achieving that goal. On the issue of independent contractors, I don't think a lot more can be said in terms of perhaps critiquing the Dean's suggestion on the tax issue. But you ought to be aware that there's a much broader discussion going on the use of independent contractors, and some might claim the misclassification. The EDD is heavily auditing businesses to make a lot of independent contractors employees. And there's litigation going on in this area. It's affecting a lot of industries, particularly, for example, in the courier industry and a number of others. And so there's a lot more to the question as to just the tax implications of employee versus independent contractor, but also the legal distinctions between the two and whether or not that's going to be exacerbated or not.
Much broader issue than we tried to make it earlier when we made the presentation?
There are additional issues beyond just the pure tax. Does a BNRT encourage or discourage the use of employees versus independent contractors? And I do have to make a comment, at least for your benefit, Mr. Chairman, on credits. The BNRT proposal, actually they propose 2 credits, R&D, although I would note that on page 190-ish or so, they leave the amounts blank. Oh no, that's the actual tax rate. They leave the amount blank, and of course some of us have worked in the last 15 years to substantially increase the state R&D credit. I would hate to see it decreased. In fact, if anything, it should be raised in conformity to a number of other states and the federal government's R&D credit. They also do a small business credit, but what's more troubling, of course, is that they eliminate quite a number of other ones. And although R&D is valuable, the only other economic development tool that we have in the state of California right now, besides that steelhead trout restoration credit, thanks to former Senator Byron Scheer, by the way, is the enterprise zone credit. And I know that Mr. Bell yesterday, he and I were both down in San Jose for an Assembly Jobs Committee hearing on the EZ program, and I think he heard from businesses, small businesses, large businesses alike about how important that program is for economic development purposes in the state of California. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McHaley. Any questions? Mr. Prea.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'd like to open up by thanking the Commission for the many hours of work that they put into these recommendations. I also want to thank the committee and the staff for all the time and for inviting us to testify. Yesterday, Mr. Parsky stated that there were 6 goals in the Commission's proposal. 3 of them were to promote long-term economic growth, a system to compete with other states, and to provide a fair and equitable tax structure. Our comments today will focus in on 2 of those, of those goals and how they are affected by 2 of the Commission's proposals. One, how does the proposed BRT affect the state's ability to attract business from out of state, specifically out-of-state sports and entertainment events that would seek to hold an event or locate in California? And 2, does the proposed tax court add fairness and equity to the state's tax structure? First, we want to thank the Commission for rejecting out of hand any expansion of the sales tax. As you may know, last year we opposed a measure that would have expanded the sales tax on sports events in California. And the reason that we opposed it was not only because of the detrimental value that it would have to those clients of ours that host those kinds of events, but because it would make it much more difficult for us to attract out-of-state events to come to California. Whether it be a NBA Finals, whether it would be a Super Bowl, whether it's a international skating event, or whether it would be concerts and so forth, expanding the sales tax to other areas would have had a detriment in that regard. Now,
so in other words, the Lakers in the playoffs against who? You know, the Nets. Would instead of having it go back and forth on the finals and the playoffs, they just do them all in New Jersey.
I don't know that it would necessarily come to that, Mr. Chair, because I think that there is the hometown crowd that you would have to address. But I think what we're looking at is, and let me give you an example, and it may not be your sport. But on October 24, this month, at AEG, at Staples Center, we're going to be hosting the Ultimate Fight Championship. It's a very popular form of entertainment. Lots of people will be coming in there. It will create an incredible amount of economic activity. We will have people flying in from all over the world to observe that event, and it creates an awful lot in the way of economic activity in Los Angeles and the environs. The UFC Championship can go anywhere they want. A lot of their, and I'm not here to represent them, but they can go to Las Vegas, New York, or any place else in the country or the world for that matter. They don't have to come to Los Angeles. But we've got a good base there. We have an attractive venue, and they want to come, and this will be their second time. And the fact of the matter is that the economics, if there were to be a sales tax, might be the tipping point for them to go someplace else. Earlier in our representation of AEG, as an example, we sought to place a cap on boxing fees because other jurisdictions did that, and therefore the fees that were being charged by California for big-time boxing events were so large that we hadn't seen a major boxing event in California since 1972. Now, in the scheme of things, that may not mean a lot, but for the economics of downtown Los Angeles, it means everything.
No, it poses an interesting question, really. I mean, if you stage one event, it's possible maybe even probable that you'd be subject to the business net receipts tax for that one.
Well, we believe that that's a question, and so
Well, I know, and so the choice would be, do I have to pay? I have to pay that. The question would be how important it is to come to the California market. Now, it's a big market, but that's a huge. That would be a huge. Although it would be apportioned, I suppose.
and Mr. Chair,
Anyway, I'm thinking out loud, but
I will tell you we have not concluded on how the proposed BNRT, offset by the other taxes that are eliminated, how that would play out. The fact is, it's not just about my client and the venue, but it's dealing with promoters of entertainment events, sporting events that are making decisions as to where they want to go, and they are they are state neutral. It doesn't matter that they come to California necessarily. For them, it's an economic decision that they've got to make a decision on, and given that much of these events are televised, they can go anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world and still satisfy their objective in terms of promoting their sport. And so we would just urge that as we look at this, and we'll come back to you, but we still have to talk with our partners, with those people who are, whether they are music entertainment, whether they are exhibitors, whether they are sporting events that are of a one-time nature, and see how that ultimately may play out. And we will come back to the committee and to others and let you know if this is, in essence, makes California more or less attractive to those kinds of special events. The other issue that we wanted to talk about is, does the proposed tax court add fairness or equity to the state's tax structure? And I want to key off of a concern that was raised by the chair earlier today, and that is we think that the replacement of an elected body with an appointed tax court removes citizens from their elected representatives and results in less responsive government. We think in large measure the success of the Board of Equalization stems from the fact that they are elected and not appointed, that they answer to the people, and that they have a connection with the electorate and with the taxpayers. The issues are often the questions of fact and law, but it is also a matter of equity or fairness, particularly in the sales tax arena or the income tax arena, where you have small businesses or individuals, many of whom are immigrants to California and to the United States, who may or may not know what the tax structure is or what their obligations are. The BOE does a remarkable job, as does the FTB, in making sure that people are educated about what their tax liabilities are. But sometimes somebody falls through the cracks. And in the sales tax example, there's not an audit except for every 3 years. So at the end of 3 years, a small vendor could find themselves having a large, sizable sales tax obligation because they didn't charge sales tax appropriately. The Board of Equalization has the ability to look at those facts, determine what the tax obligation is, and in essence, rather than simply imposing the tax liability on them, can work out a payment plan where that business stays in business, but that they're able to make their obligation whole. Second, the tax court proposal, we think, would result in greater difficulty to individuals and to small businesses as well as large businesses in terms of representing themselves before an adjudicatory body. Right now, the Board of Equalization is an adjudicatory body that operates under a set of rules, but they have the ability to be flexible in terms of how they're going to deal with the taxpayer. Former State Senator Becky Morgan made a reference that she believed that most taxpayers before the Board of Equalization are represented by counsel. Our observation is that that's not the case, that fully 80% are represented by themselves or by their accountants, and that only 20% are represented by counsel. And I think the important... Assemblymember Cotto, this is our observation, given our experience there at the Board of Equalization, is that most people are not represented by a lawyer when they come before the Board of Equalization. And we're looking at this in a rough, but that 4 out of 5 taxpayers either are representing themselves or have an accountant or someone else assisting them, but not an attorney. About 20% have counsel. And so that's, when you look at it from a small business perspective, if a small business has a $25,000 tax liability imposed upon them, they've got to make a decision. Do I want to take this in other words, under a tax court? Do I want to hire counsel and adjudicate it and cost myself $25,000, or do I simply want to pay the amount due and get on with my life? And in essence, we think it creates a bar to representation, or a bar to getting their issue heard before an adjudicatory body. It's not an enhancement. And so we're concerned about that. The other provision in the proposal is that under current law, as we testified yesterday, if a taxpayer prevails at the Board of Equalization, it's game over. The thing is done, the taxpayer goes on, the state goes on, and then nothing more comes of it. Under this proposal, the state would be able to appeal the decision by the tax court, and presumably all the way to the state Supreme Court. The average taxpayer does not have the economic power to, in other words, to go up against the state on repeated times. And so we think it gives undue leverage to the state in terms of a burden against the taxpayer. So for those reasons, we ask the question, is this more fair? Is this more equitable? We don't think so. And then finally, the state ought to also consider what the cost is going to be to the state. I mean, while there is a proposal, one of the proposals is to merge the two tax agencies together and create a Department of Revenue, that would require a ballot measure. But what this does, it will, barring that from occurring or pending that occurring, you also have an issue as to having, in essence, the Board of Equalization will continue to operate. It will continue to have more or less the same cost. There will not be any appreciable savings, and what you will have is a new body that will cost upwards from either $5 million or up, depending upon who you talk to. We know that, as an example, a tax court proposal is not a new one. There was a commission back in 2003. It was the Commission on Tax Policy in the New Economy. Sounds familiar. And they, too, had a recommendation regarding a tax court, and they estimated that the cost of a tax court would be $6.5 to $9.5 million, depending upon the number of judges.
Who was this, FTB or BOE?
Who is making that estimation? Yeah. Actually, it was by William Vickery, who is the administrative director of the Courts Judicial Council of California. And he made that in a reference to William Rosendahl, who was the chairman of that commission. Now, there was a prior proposal in 2004, AB 2472, and in the Assembly Appropriations Committee analysis, they estimated a net revenue, or a net cost to the state of $5 million. So if you look at all of those issues out there, we think that the tax, well, I guess I'll reference Ms. Pilsticker's comments. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We don't think that the issue of fairness dictates if you would, an elimination of the BOE as an adjudicatory body and replacing it by a more formal, more costly, and less responsive tax court.
Well, of course, we don't know what the estimates are in terms of how much revenue will be brought in by the tax court, given that the state can now appeal. But I mean, the point is well taken in terms of the issue, and also the pro per issue. And maybe you maintain this current system for claims under $1 million or disputes under $1 million, and then all the rest go to the tax court. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of ways we can structure it. Not to say that that's something that the legislature is going to want to do, but I mean, certainly you should be around and be ready to make suggestions should this gain any momentum. Mr. Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee member Cotto, for the opportunity to be here and speak this afternoon on really was an incredibly important issue. It is, with no, I think, as has been mentioned by everybody else, I think that's testified here, any less credit to the Commission based on the comments that I may make and others have made regarding to the proposal that they put forward, because the work that they put into it was truly immense, and it was a monumental task, and I want to give Chairman Parsky credit for being able to organize that. The process wasn't perfect, but again, the task was monumental. I want to start out by saying, to addressing one issue, there's, as an advocate, one of the issues we always look at is what are the criticisms of the comments that we're going to be making regarding something else. And one of the favorite tactics for addressing that is going up front and saying this is what the opposition is going to say, or this is what the other side is going to say. And frankly, we see that as trying to paint, myself at least, is painting us into a corner, saying dismiss us because what we're saying is really considering the whole picture. But yeah, that would be one of the issues. The N in National Federation of Independent Business is really naysayers. Yes, no. But in reality, as an advocate for small businesses, I wouldn't be doing my members justice if I didn't come up here and raise the issues that I'm going to raise with regard to the proposal, and of course give credit where credit is due. However, I wanted to start off by addressing some of the principles. Several of the principles in the Commission's charter deal with economic growth, competition with other states, job creation, and things that we know are necessary for California going forward. Volatility in revenue is one principle. However, it became apparent in the Commission's proceedings that was largely the focus of their discussion, and that was really a large part of what was driving, I think, the ultimate decisions that were made with regard to the proposals. As an aside, it's important to note, and I think it's been mentioned by Ms. Hunt, I believe, yes, that stable revenues generally mean lower revenues. I mean, if anybody thinks about the stock market versus the bonds, I mean, you have more guaranteed stable sources of income versus more risky sources of income. So the higher risk, higher reward principle applies. So going to a less volatile system does create that issue. However, we, as Ms. Peelsticker mentioned, believe that the legislature's responsibility in regarding how we spend those resources is really where the major responsibility lies. We found during the proceedings there was very little discussion of prosperity and economic growth. And when small businesses are the primary job creators in California and nationally, creating anywhere from 3/4 to 100% of the jobs in this state, under the recession we're in right now, I don't think anyone's arguing that large businesses are in fact creating jobs. If any jobs are being created, it's in a small business. And many of those jobs are being created by people who recently found themselves unemployed. Additionally, the argument that simplicity is improved or generated by this new proposal, I think is something that we need to take a skeptical look at, because if you look at the BNRT and some of the other proposals, particularly as it regards to the phase-in, what credits we count, what deductions we include, there really are a lot of issues there that A, have not been addressed, or B, remain with regard to the independent contractors and other elements that the Commission did not get to. Finally,
I think in terms of simplicity issue, I understood the Commission to be saying make the approach simple. In other words, revenues, income revenues have been going up because we've been imposing higher taxes on individuals, and look at it, it's this big of the pie. Here's the corporate tax portion, and I don't know, it was in sales tax portion. So they said, let's just keep it simple. Let's lower it over here and raise it over there, I think is what they were saying. Now, the details, there's nothing simplistic about the details. I agree with you on that.
Well, in terms of the simplicity, I was, if you look at the phase-in particular, and I was going to address this later, but, if you have a BNRT being phased in as corporate income taxes being completely eliminated, personal income taxes being reduced, and the state sales tax portion is being reduced, theoretically you can end up in a situation where you maintain some or all of each part of those taxes. So ultimately, aside from getting into the very specific details of each credit deduction and such.
Right, that phase-in is a little complicated.
That can be very complicated, and in representing small businesses,
in terms of how it works out, yeah.
That creates a lot of uncertainty and concern. With regard to the current system, I mean, it's been stated, we're in a crisis, we're not in a crisis, and I'm not here to make a judgment on that. However, I would note that there are certainly many improvements we could make to the current system. The fact that businesses pay sales tax on inputs doesn't make sense to us. The fact that we don't provide tax deductions for health savings account contributions, it doesn't make sense to us. And so some other issues. And I realize that these are not the things that are in the purview here, but
That's another hearing.
there are other. What I mean to say is the system we have today is not perfect by any stretch. Moving on, I think to the substantive point I want to make, which is regard to the business net receipts tax. I would be remiss and probably would be reminded by the chairman on multiple future occasions if I did not acknowledge that some of the other changes can potentially offset some of the increase from the business net receipts tax. Now, we're not making a judgment as to whether or not it would completely offset, because I think, based on our analyses, that's certainly not the case. However, I think being recently removed from the chairman's Christmas card list, I would want to acknowledge that.
What did you do?
Apparently, I testified more than was anticipated or desired. But to move on,
All right, now you're off my Mother's Day list.
Oh no, not this chairman. I apologize. The Chairman Parsky.
Oh,
My apologies to the committee chairman.
I don't. I mean, no offense. I don't remember. I don't remember you. I'm going.
No. No harm. The major point I want to make with regard to the. I will.
But let's go on. Yeah, are you just joking, or are you because?
No, I was, Mr. Chairman. I was simply making a joke. So
okay, there's no basis for that.
No, it was simply a joke. I was a frequent testifier in the commission hearings, and anyway, the point I want to make with regard to the business net receipts tax is there are a few. The main point is, the current system takes into account ability to pay. Business net receipts tax does not. We put forward a scenario in one of the commission workshops on the business net receipts tax that showed a business losing tens of thousands of dollars, yet owing tens of thousands of dollars under the BNRT. Now, certainly, I don't think anybody would think that that is a fair system, but that is one of the unfortunate fallout of the business net receipts tax. And additionally, this effectively, as has been stated, becomes a tax on labor. And when we talk about job creation, particularly when we're suffering a 12.2% unemployment rate, that is something that we need to be very, very sensitive to. Additionally, as has been addressed, that puts pressure towards businesses towards moving to independent contractors, staffing agencies, and as was a little side conversation here earlier, being put pressure on from the other side by EDD and other regulatory agencies that are trying to, based on the opinions of some of our members, quash the independent contractor altogether. It's important to remember that independent contractors are very typically how many businesses start out. And in addition to that, many businesses use independent contractors as a bridge to bringing on full-time employees. So we should not be considering a system or considering changes that really discriminate against independent contractors. And likewise, we need to make sure that the system isn't unnecessarily biased in the reverse direction as well. But we want to make sure that we protect that avenue for business startups and growth in California. The intersection of some of these issues does create an interesting situation. One of the issues that the chairman admonished all of us to consider is the rate. The rate is very important. The rate that has been put forward in this proposal, or at least is being projected as kind of the target or maximum rate for this proposal, is roughly 3 to 4 times what any other state is doing in terms of a similar tax rate.
Okay. There's only one chairman in this committee, so I assume you're talking about
Chairman Parsky.
Mr. Parsky. Okay, so Mr. Parsky. Or Chairman Parsky would help.
Yes, I will admonish myself. And
you're going to get off my list.
Forgive me, I do not have many privileges to testify before your committee, and this this is certainly one of them.
You're doing fine.
Thank you. But the rate that is being discussed under the Commission's proposal is roughly 3 to 4 times what any other state is using. So certainly that creates a lot more concern for businesses in California, particularly for our smaller businesses, when we see such a magnitude change relative to other states that are using anything.
I thought that according to the information that there was
Yeah, Michigan, anything that looks like this. Ohio has something similar.
And
Texas has something, in the neighborhood of a value-added tax, but not this. So Michigan's the only one that has anything that looks like this, and it looks pretty much like this, and then theirs is a 1%. And their revenues were off in terms of what they thought, their projections, and in terms of revenue that would come in, and the actual revenues that did come in.
Yeah,
I think for 1 year.
Yeah, so there are a few that are similar. Michigan's certainly the closest, and there is a significant difference between the rates we're talking about here. Other issues that we of concern with regard to this proposal, one is the elimination of the corporate income tax, but maintenance, though at a lower level of the PIT, is something that concerns small business. One point to remember is that 80% of small businesses approximately file under the personal income tax structure. So for a small business, you are going to be paying the PIT. Now you're also going to be paying the BNRT. For a larger business, a corporation, you will not be paying the corporate income tax, but you'll be paying the BNRT. So there is a significant benefit on the corporate side, but on the small business side, where you're filing under the PIT, there's a significant disparity. And generally, we don't think that that's a very positive change.
But there's an exemption, right, for small businesses?
There is an exemption to a certain level, and I did want to acknowledge that as well, because that will, though we haven't analyzed whether or not the statement that 90% of small businesses in California would be exempt, we do understand that a number of businesses would be. So we're still in the process of analyzing that particular assertion, but it is certainly something to consider. However, as small businesses begin to raise above that threshold of $500,000 and $250,000, which is an interesting combination to begin with, they would be subject to both taxes under that situation. Additionally, and one of the more positive elements, I should say, is the elimination of the state share of the sales tax, and particularly as that applies to business inputs. And it's also important to note that the business at receipts does not count capital investments as well. So those are some positive issues. As I said, there are some positive elements to this proposal. We are very concerned about the business at receipts tax, and I would hate to see job growth and economic prosperity, long-term economic prosperity, sacrificed at the altar of stabilizing revenues, because I think that would do a disservice to both the businesses in our state and Californians in general, as well as the state services that are provided through taxpayer dollars.
All right, thank you. Any questions? Hearing none, I want to thank all of you for your patience. I realize we've been running over, but this, this isn't the kind of issue that we ought to have the usual hearing on, where everyone gets 2 minutes to testify, pro and con, and everybody else just states their opposition or support and their affiliation. We really need to write legislation here, and we need to know what we're doing. So I do appreciate your being here.
I just want to compliment you, Mr. Chair, and the staff for the quality of the presentations both days. I mean, it's been well worth the investment of time listening to the different viewpoints. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, staff, for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have some few minutes for public comments. Seeing no one, we're going to adjourn. Remind the committee that we have a hearing on next Wednesday, and the subject of that hearing will be to hear from the experts and to take each aspect of the proposal and to analyze it and get, as best we can, an understanding of what the consequences would be, pro and con, to California if it were adopted. We're going to start, and we'll start at 1 o'clock.
I might want to ask that when I asked the question about which issues they felt, the commission earlier this morning felt needed a lot more attention, they identified 4 or 5 of them. Make sure that those get included in the presentation so we can respond to those.
Definitely. Okay, I want to thank everyone for their patience. FTB, thank you so much. We got close, but no cigar in terms of bringing you up here. But I think it was very important to have you here. We're going to ask. We want you to come back on Wednesday, as well as BOE. And but your input has been very, very helpful to us. All right. No further matters coming before this committee. This committee is adjourned.